Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Adweek webinar. We'll be looking at what you don't know about millennials, but what you should know. And today's webinar is being brought to you in partnership with Simmons Research. Let me introduce today's speakers. We're very happy to be joined by two people here from Simmons Research, and they're going to be sharing some of the great findings that Simmons has about millennials. We've got Jennifer Olson, who's the Senior Product Marketing Manager, and she really sort of leverages insights to tell stories about the modern U.S. consumer. And again, you're going to see she's going to be sharing some of the data that they have today on the Millennial segment. And we're also joined by Ashley Brown, who's the Client Engagement Manager at Simmons Research, and she's responsible for helping clients find the data they need within the Simmons' suite of solutions. So let me pass this on over to Jen for today's webinar.
Great. Thank you, Stuart. We're really glad to be presenting here today. So as a brief introduction, like they said, my name is Jennifer Olson, Senior Marketing Manager at Simmons Research, and I'm here with Ashley from our Client Engagement team, and we're going to present some findings on millennials to you today. So some might say that the quest to understand millennials and predict how they might behave is akin to searching for a unicorn. Others say the topic has been covered seemingly endlessly. A recent Google search for millennials gave over 48.6 million results. So those in the second camp might just be closer to the truth for that one. That said, though, we're going to try and tease out something new for you today and hope that we'll give you some, food for thought on this particular group of consumers. So for today's webinar, we're going to start with a quick overview of Simmons Research and the data sets that we use to create this presentation. Then we'll dive into the data itself, looking at, who millennials are, what they do, and where you can reach them. And as Stuart mentioned, we'll be answering the questions at the end, so let's get started. So Simmons has been collecting data on the American consumer for over 60 years. We do this by overlaying survey data and passively measured data to give a complete picture of the American consumer, or any subset of the American consumer, like millennials, for example, that you might want to create using the data. Our flagship study is our National Consumer Study. This has over 25,000 adult respondents annually. Within this data set, we measure over 60,000 different consumer elements. That includes all major media, over 600 attitudes and opinions, 500 product categories, and over 8,000 brands. So for this Millennials webinar, we've also included data from some of our other studies. So they overlay additional insights on top of what we've just described. We have our Simmons Connect study that includes our online and mobile panel data. It looks at app and website usage across smartphones, tablets, and PCs, along with cross-platform data for 11 traditional, digital, and mobile platforms. And our Simmons New Media study that dives into the ways people consume the newest in media technology and trends. And our new Simmons Enhanced Media Measurement study, which looks at trends in media, including streaming, binge watching, cord cutting, and even fake news. And finally, our Simmons Local data, which takes our national consumer study and brings it all down to the local level, all the way down to the zip code. So with that out of the way, I'd like to introduce Ashley to start us out with who the millennials are.
Thanks, Jen. Again, my name is Ashley Brown. I am a Client Engagement Manager here at Simmons Research. I'm going to go ahead and give you a few little background notes before we start the webinar. So for this webinar, we have defined millennials as those being ages 18 to 39. As you can tell, the millennial generation, it covers a large span of ages, and it's encompassing individuals that are in many different life stages. That is why today we've decided to take a closer look at millennials. We're going to look at them more as like two separate generations or sub-generations rather than just one as a whole. We've broken them down into the young millennials. Those we're defining as ages 18 to 29, and the old millennials, those that we're defining as ages 30 to 39. When looking at the young versus old millennial, it's really important to note just how different the worlds they grew up in were. While the old millennials, they can still remember the world where there was no internet, where we even had dial-up internet and got kicked off if somebody called in the middle of your internet session. And the only cell phones we knew about were being used by Zach Morris on TV or even being carried around in a bag by their parents. This is just a fantasy world to the young millennial. They have had technology around pretty much their entire existence. So millennials as a whole are described as being tech, internet, and social media obsessed. They're kind of described as frivolous, fly by the seat of their pants, and free-spirited types. While this is true for some, the way these two groups grew up and where they are in their life is really shaping the differences between them, and it's something that really needs to be taken note of. Because let's face it, a 22-year-old and a 36-year-old are most likely going to be pretty different at the end of the day, and this should be taken into account when you're trying to reach these groups. So let's size the market of millennials here. There's 91.2 total millennials. That's people aged 18 to 39. 47 million young millennials and 44.2 million old millennials. We can also take a deeper look into their ethnicity regarding if they're Hispanic or non. There are 35.6 million non-Hispanic young millennials, and pretty equal with the old non-Hispanic millennials at 35.5 million. But if you take a look at the young Hispanic millennial, there is quite a difference. 11.4 million young Hispanic millennials and 8.7 million old Hispanic millennials. So there's definitely a difference there. Young millennials are more racially and ethnically diverse. 24% of them are Hispanic, while only 20% of old millennials are going to be Hispanic, and less than 2/3 of the young millennials are white. Okay, so we're going to take a closer look at our Hispanic millennials here. Of the 91.2 million total millennials, 20.2 million of them are going to be Hispanic. And on the left here in the pie chart, we can look at the generational breakdown of the Hispanic millennial. First generation Hispanics, these are people who are not born in the U.S., make up the largest share of the Hispanic millennials at 43%. They're followed closely by the second generation. These are people who are born in the U.S., but their mom and dad were not. And then finally, the smallest share of our Hispanic millennials are going to be third generation Hispanics, with both them and their parents being born in the United States. We can also take a look at the language preference of our Hispanic millennials. Overall, they prefer to speak mostly English. But if you take a look at the older Hispanic millennial, it's worth noting that some of them, they do have a solid presence of speaking mostly or only Spanish. The same holds true when we're looking for language preferred when doing activities like reading, TV, radio, or when online. The younger millennial and the older millennial prefer mostly or only English, but the older millennial does have a strong presence of people who prefer to mostly or only use Spanish when they're doing these activities. So we know about our Hispanic and non-Hispanic millennial and just young and old in general. So let's take a look at some of the basic demographics of the young versus the old millennial. On the left here, we have a demographic breakdown of our young millennial, and on the right is going to be the same exact thing, but for the old millennial. As you can see, there are some obvious differences here. Given the young millennial is in the beginnings of what a millennial themselves would call the adulting phase of life, there's less presence of marriage, less children in the household. But what certainly came to a surprise to me, and actually might to you as well, is that 53% of our young millennials are already homeowners. There tends to be this mindset that millennials are boomeranging back and forth to their parents' homes, but you can see here over half of them actually own homes in the young category, while 57% of old millennials are homeowners. Taking a look at the right, the old millennial, you can see they're in full-on quote-unquote adulting mode. They have a higher household income, they're well-employed, married, and over half of them already have children. The key difference here between these two groups is their levels of education. For the young millennial, most of them are still in college or are newly graduated, while the older millennials have graduated and 41% of them have completed grad school or more. These two subgenerations are at completely different points in their lives. So let's take a look here at their individual employment income. You can see that the average income of an old millennial is around $56,000 per year, while the young have an average income of $32,000 per year. That's a really big difference in between the two. The younger millennials, they're obviously just getting started down the path of their adult life, and their salaries are certainly showing that. The older millennials, they're making more money after being in the workforce longer, but they're still climbing their way up the financial ladder. They haven't matured financially yet, and this is something to keep in mind when we're trying to get them to spend their money with us. Jen's going to take a little bit deeper look into their financial state in the next section for us. So what's up with millennials? You might be seeing this thing at the top that says "what's up" and kind of laughing like, wow, that girl's lame if you're a young millennial. But if you're an old millennial, you'll probably remember the Budweiser commercial with the frogs that this came from. So that's just another difference between all of us. But really, the answer to this question is a ton is up with millennials. Like I said earlier, they're in full-on adulting mode, or they're just getting started, or maybe they're just doing kind of whatever they want. They're not working. They're taking a gap year before they figure out what they want to do, traveling or living at home and kind of working a free-spirited job. These more free-spirited younger millennials acts seem to have been lost on the old millennials. The only thing really consistent in the life of a young millennial is change. School, family, job, finance, they're all on the move for this group. Young millennials are more likely to have started or gone back to school, graduated, gotten married, had their first child, or bought their first home in the last year than an old millennial. They're less employed. They're more likely to start new jobs or even change the jobs that they have. They're true young adults. Their adult life is really just getting started, and the path they will take is not yet determined. Change and growth is really at the center of their life. But they will age out of it eventually, and their life will stabilize a bit. At least that's what we've come to expect, and that's certainly what their parents are hoping for. Then they'll have the joys of being an adult with grown-up responsibilities. In the last 12 months, old millennials are more likely than young to have bought a new home, which was not their first, refinanced their home, or made a major home improvement. On a personal front, they're more likely than a young millennial to have separated or divorced, had a second child, or had a child enter the school. They're in the later stages of their early adult life. Things are getting real for them, and life is really settling down. So again, oftentimes we hear the millennials are, as a whole, as being referred to kind of as restless and uneasy, flippant, non-committal. A lot of them call them the job-hopping generation. But if we take a look, this really doesn't seem to be holding true for the older millennial. But it will be interesting to watch over time how the young millennial settles into their lives as they grow older. Will they follow the same traditional path as the older millennial and the Generation X before them? Or will they live up to their generation's reputation of being far less traditional and more erratic in their life's path? It's really something only time can tell. So if you're looking here at our politics and voting, younger millennials are really fitting into this free spirit, carefree description of the millennial overall if you're really taking a look at how they interact with politics. The majority of young millennials are actually registered to vote, which aside from Hispanics, who historically have a smaller voter turnout and political involvement anyway, you can see that younger millennials are way less likely to have actually voted despite being registered to in their last election than the older millennials. The percentage of older millennials actually having voted are still sadly pretty low, but they're definitely more likely to be active participants than their younger millennial counterparts. This is yet another key difference between the two groups and something to really take note of, especially in our current political climate, where millennials are being given a lot of credit for things and changes and are a main focus of politicians and advertisers alike. So where are millennials moving? Here we have a glimpse of just where millennials are at all over the country. But if you see here, if we take a look at the young millennials, at the areas in red, this is areas they're over-indexing for living. Young millennials, they're living the city life. They're more likely to live in large urban metropolitan areas like New York, LA, Chicago, San Francisco, Miami. Younger millennials are on the move. They have a lot of free time, and they're out doing this while living in bigger cities. But here, if we take a look at older millennials, the map changes drastically. Our areas of concentration are going to be in smaller cities rather than big ones. Younger millennials are leaving the big cities and heading to smaller ones like Denver, Houston, Atlanta, and Minneapolis. Don't really count them out just yet, though. They haven't made the full transition to living the burbs life. So we've broken our millennials down into the young and the old. The younger millennials, they're just getting started. They're living in bigger cities, and they're more likely than old to be experiencing major change, both personally and professionally. The older millennials, they're reaching a point of stabilization in their lives. They've gotten jobs, changed a few already, and are just better established overall. They live in smaller cities. They're more likely to be married and have children. They've taken the traditional path of the generations before them. So we've established many key differences between the young and the old. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand it over to Jen. She's going to take a little bit more of a look at what the old and young millennials are thinking and doing in regards to finance and retail.
Great. Thanks, Ashley. So with over 60,000 variables included in our data, it would be pretty easy to go into the weeds on this. So we've kind of pulled out a couple particular categories to focus on. We're going to start with some financial services info. There have been more than a few articles on how this generation, and Ashley mentioned, are chronically underemployed and fiscally challenged. But this is a group that is in what is most likely the most complex time of their lives in terms of finding their direction and figuring out what they're going to do, who they are going to be, and what's going to happen when they grow up. And not all of them fit the stereotype either. As we've seen with some of the demographics in the first section, the young and old millennials are often in two very distinct phases of their lives, and nowhere is this more clear than the ways they deal with their finances. So credit is something that's generally earned over time, so it's not surprising to see that our older millennials are 44% more likely than their younger cohort to have a credit card, with about 2/3 market penetration of the older age group. Not surprising, but the fact that nearly half of our younger millennials do carry this kind of plastic is higher than I anticipated based on what I've read. Also higher than anticipated are their credit scores. So 58% of young millennials and 64% of old millennials have scores that are considered prime or above, which is in the range of 661 to 850. And as our older millennials continue to build on their credit history, they're also concerned about the safety of their credit score and are 50% more likely than their younger peers to subscribe to a credit monitoring service. We see a similar pattern with bank accounts, investments, and retirement plans. Our older millennials are more likely to have all of these than their younger peers, but this is an opportunity for marketers to reach the younger millennials who are just at the beginning of their financial journey. Nearly 3/4 of our old millennials have investment, in contrast to 62% of their younger peers. Still an impressive number for people at the beginning of their careers and of their adult lives. In terms of 401k and planning for retirement, we see that both groups could use a push on planning towards their future. Now, with the multitude of transitions this group is going through, their minds never stop thinking about the next step on their journey to success. To them, success is defined by career aspirations, money earned, social status, and control. Marketers can speak the language of this group by incorporating these themes into their messaging about planning for their financial future. So digging deeper into what differentiates and motivates each group in terms of personal finance, we compared the two groups actually to each other. As might be expected with such a large and diverse cohort, there were some statements that overlapped between the groups, but to tease out the intergenerational differences, we looked at those on the extreme ends, where one agreed and the other did not. So our younger millennials want others to think that they are a financial success, but they do tend to spend money without thinking and prefer to pay cash or at least use their debit cards. Though they do pay attention to their future financial success and are willing to pay for good advice and are receptive to advertising in order to make this success happen. Our old millennials, again, they're further along this whole path to adulting. They have interest in learning more about financial services, and they've stepped up to the plate in terms of personal responsibility, with life and home insurance moving up the priority list and continuing in the direction of planning for their future, including retirement. So finishing up our financial services section, we wanted to take a deeper look at how millennials pay their bills, this time adding our Hispanic millennials into the mix. With more than one answer being possible here, depending on the bill maybe, it's definitely the case that all our millennials are more likely to rely on technology and the conveniences it provides. Our older millennials, who are probably the ones saddled with more bills like mortgages and car payments, they skew significantly higher than the other groups on online, mobile, and auto pay, but some do still use mail and the phone to pay some of their bills. It's interesting here to note that the trends among millennials, young millennials, and old millennials are mirrored in the Hispanic group, but at lower levels for the most part. Overall, what we see here and what we'll see more of later is that mobile and online interfaces are the first line of communication and information with millennials. So it would be valuable for brands to build on mobile and online tools and use positive interactions to build loyalty among this impressionable group. We're switching gears here now to look at shopping and the motivations that drive our old and young millennials. Of the nearly 100 psychographics that we have specifically pertaining to shopping and shopping behaviors, we saw some agreement across the board for a number of these statements, including preferences for specialty stores, variations on brand loyalty, being influencers for fashion for friends and family, and a love of shopping in general. But to see where the differences are, again, we compared the two against each other to find out what motivates each group separately from the other. For our young millennials, shopping is a social event. Their choices are driven by trends, and sales and impulse buys really drive their purchases. For old millennials, shopping is sort of a two-pronged thing. It can be an escape. They like to go shopping alone, or they like to shop with their children. Their choices, again, are driven by these children. It's also driven by prices and comfort. So Simmons has a set of shopping segments built using attitudes and behaviors measured in our national consumer study. Each respondent is put into one of these 6 buckets based on their responses to various questions in the survey. Going into these in depth could be a webinar unto itself, so I'm going to share some highlights that pertain particularly to our groups. So young millennials are 29% more likely than their older millennial peers to be mall maniacs, and the definition of that is shoppers who like to try new products, stores, and styles. They connect and interact with their favorite brands, and they really just love to shop. Our old millennials are 40% more likely to be upscale cliques than their younger peers. This group is made up of knowledgeable consumers who buy both in-store and online, prefer to carefully research their purchases before buying, and also do a lot of price comparisons. Now, the other large group across our millennials is status drivers, and this segment finds shopping fun and recreational and are very willing to travel and spend money to follow their trends. So here we're again comparing between the two to see where each group is more exclusively likely to shop. The choices here mirror some of the statements with the priorities and life stages we've seen throughout this deck, with fashion and beauty more exclusive to our young millennials, while home improvement and decor, kids items, and shopping for the best deals resonate with our older, more responsible millennials. So let's take a look at some of the attitudes around online shopping that differentiate our young and old millennials from each other. It's a common theme running through this presentation, a little foreshadowing there, that younger millennials rely on their cell phones for a whole lot of things, including shopping and recommendations, but it stands out that they are more interested in hearing about products and services via email. Product recommendations via website based on their previous purchases also resonate with this group. Our old millennials turn out to be bargain hunters in disguise, doing showrooming versus via the internet, shopping around to get bargains and specials, and both planning and doing their shopping on the internet. Social media plays a part in their online experience as well. They post reviews for others to read and act as influencers, but are really less interested in reading those reviews that others have posted. So shopping online is, not surprisingly, popular across our millennial groups. They enjoy the convenience, the selection, and the ability to compare prices. Some categories are popular across the board with this group, including books, clothes, and shoes, but the differences between the groups, again, show how different our two subsets are when it comes to what they are more likely to purchase than their opposite peer group. Our young millennials are looking to be entertained. They're more likely than their older peers to be purchasing tickets for all sorts of things, movies, concerts, and other events. Electronic gadgets and video games are also up there on the list, and music downloads too. They also purchase clothing, accessories, and cosmetics online, similar to their brick and mortar purchases. Now, our older millennials, on the other hand, have a more pragmatic approach to online shopping. Crunched for time with their growing families and blossoming careers, they buy groceries, baby and pet supplies, financial services, and office and home furnishings. They're not, however, all work and no play. Travel, including hotel reservations, tours, and other services are also on their list, as are apparel and games for their kids. So with the sheer amount of online shopping choices available, drilling down gets interesting. Of course, some of the obvious suspects pop to the top in terms of overall popularity. Hello, Amazon and eBay. But what we're looking at again here is the ones that are exclusive to one and not the other. Our younger millennials, having not known a time where there was no internet shopping, are more willing to try out all sorts of new sites, including those like Zazzle, an on-demand marketplace where curated products can be customized. But the tried and true also resonate with this group to some extent. They're more likely than their elder peers to be shopping at Macy's and Kmart, are looking to upgrade their home, apartment, or dorm room from Bed Bath & Beyond, and maybe taking advantage of the family membership to Sam's Club for deals on everything from soup to actual nuts. The practicality of our older millennials shows up again when contrasting their more likely shopping sites online. Home Depot makes an appearance here, as it did with the brick and mortar stores, and they're shopping for the best prices for their family's needs at Kohl's, Walmart, and JCPenney, one-stop shopping for all things, but also embracing the variety and service that they can get from Zappos. Now, overall, the adult penetration for shopper loyalty cards lies around 40%. Millennials overall are approaching that number, but are not quite there yet. Our young millennials are below average among millennials overall and among adults for their use of these, overall and by type. They come close to the overall adult average for cards with restaurants and coffee shops, which is 7% versus 9%, but are otherwise yet to be drawn in, an opportunity for marketers to reach out to this as yet underserved market. Our older millennials, on the other hand, embrace the deals and convenience that come with loyalty cards. They are 16% more likely than adults overall to have any kind of loyalty card, 35% more likely to have a restaurant one, and over 20% more likely to embrace practical types of cards like convenience stores, gas stations, and grocery stores. In this case, marketers can look to enhance the experiences that these older millennials already have with their brands by building on the loyalty and usage that are already there. And for our last slide on the retail segment, we're going to head back to some shopper insights for in-store brick-and-mortar retailers and merchandisers and how they can work in-store to capture the attention of our millennial shoppers, although these insights can be useful for online retailers as well. In the National Consumer Study, we ask our respondents, when you shop, how often do you refer to each of the following for finding and choosing the items that you buy? In this example, we're looking at the answers for always or sometimes to find out what helps guide shoppers in store to brands. So when compared with adults overall, our millennials as a group are more likely to refer to the internet, that's no big surprise there, right? Advertising on the shopping cart, and computerized information or coupon centers when they're looking for brand and category information in stores. But when we look at the two groups separately, we can see that our older millennials are much more influenced by nearly all these in-store options. Perhaps because they're busy and they want somebody to point them in that general direction. So the one big takeaway from this slide is that the internet is an important tool for them. Not a big surprise there. But young or old, while they're doing their shopping, showrooming is a regular occurrence for over 2/3 of our millennials, and they're using their mobile devices to find out more information and to price compare on a regular basis. So before I hand this back over to Ashley to talk about where to reach them, let's do a quick summary of what they do to find some overarching commonalities. While it's true that there are behaviors and attitudes that do align our young and old millennials into that overall millennials group, it's key for marketers to be able to tease out the differences between the two in terms of where they are in their lives and how to reach them. Aspirational versus pragmatic sums it up, so tooling your message to reach each group that way will go a long way in speaking to what they need to hear. Now, with that said, let me turn this back over to Ashley to look at where to reach our millennials.
Thanks, Jen. I'm going to start with our cord cutting. Cord cutting is obviously a huge trend right now. People are talking about it all the time. There are a wealth of options out there for the non-cable or non-satellite user, and each day more and more people are cutting the cord on traditional cable. In fact, 50% of all cord cutters are millennials. Here we're taking a look at our cord segments, and as you can see, a majority of each of our millennial groups are what we call cord maybes. These are people that currently subscribe to cable or satellite, but might get rid of it in the near future. Something to note here is our Hispanic millennials, who have a higher likelihood to have never had cable and don't plan on ever subscribing to it. In general, cable has never been a necessity, and it's not a huge part of their lives. Something else to take note of are the older millennials, and that they have a larger percentage of cord loyalists. These are people that will not be getting rid of cable. These are perhaps our older old millennials who grew up in a house where cable was a necessity and they can't quite get their mind around getting rid of it. Again, though, it really comes as no surprise that a majority of millennials are living in the cord maybe segment, given the options for streaming and new technologies that allow cutting the cord to be pretty easy these days. These cord maybes will most likely convert to cord cutters in the near future. So here, when are they going to convert? We're looking at what we call intenders here on this slide. These are people who are planning to cut the cord in the near future. There are 11.5 million total intenders, and of those, 6.4 million of them are millennials. But if we take a closer look, over half of the millennial intenders, at around 4 million, are going to be our young millennials. So the young millennials are leading the charge in the cord cutting trend. Younger people, they're better at embracing change and adapting to newer technologies. So as the young millennials continue to grow older and enter the market, and what are definitely going to be their prime spending years, and as they're finding their place in the world, it can be presumed that this trend will have an even more profound effect on the cable market than it really has already. And it looks like it's going to be happening soon, as most say they're planning to cut the cord within the next 2 to 6 months, or 6 months to a year. We established these young millennials have a high propensity to have already cut the cord or are planning to do so. So what are they using to replace it? Well, streaming is your answer there. While the older millennials definitely prefer streaming to video on demand, the younger millennial is outpacing the older millennial in streaming in every single group. The younger you are, the more likely you are to stream. Take a quick look at our Hispanic millennial, and you can see that over 70% of both young and old Hispanic millennials prefer streaming. This can be attributed to the fact that, like we've already established, cable really has just never been a part of their life. And historically, younger people adapt to newer versions of technology quicker, and streaming is obviously one of these. So millennials love streaming, we know that. 48% of young millennials say they stream programs more often than they watch live TV, while only 38% of old millennials stream more than live TV. Why do they prefer streaming to live TV? Well, most of them are streaming because of the programming, with a majority of both young millennials, 50% of them, and old millennials, 44% of them, saying they like streaming because they have original TV shows. Ever heard of binge watching? I know I take part in it, and I'm sure most of you do as well. Millennials account for 40% of those who binge watch at least once monthly. And when looking at heavy binge watchers, these are people who binge watch at least 4 times a month or more. Millennials account for 44% of those. This also holds true among the Hispanics. 60% of them, young millennial Hispanics, agree that they're watching because of the original programming. But you can see that something else is important to them, and that is getting more bang for their buck. 52% of them say that what they get in return for streaming is better to them versus what they get in return for paying for cable. So what are they watching? In the left TV are cable networks that the young millennial is watching, but the old millennial is not. They don't share an audience for channels like Freeform, which was formerly ABC Family, Adult Swim, and MTV2. Even Nick at Night, which ironically is filled with programs that the old millennials grew up watching. Nostalgia is really in right now, and the young millennials are buying into that. And on the right, we have things like HGTV, Bravo, and A&E that the old millennials are tuning into, but the young are not. As an old millennial myself, I can definitely attest to most of these being among the networks I watch most often, as well as my friends and colleagues that are my age. As we've talked about before, these two groups are just really at different life stages. They have different maturity levels, and their programming choices are showing that. Old millennials are doing major home improvements. They're having family and shopping at places like Home Depot and Lowe's. So HGTV makes sense for them. And younger millennials, they're watching less topical television because they're still coming into their own as adults. These are the shows that require less focus, and they're multitaskers, which I'll go into a little bit more later. It isn't to say that they're not watching the same things at all, because they do have some in common for sure. ESPN, Showtime, and cooking are some of those, but these are the ones that they do not share viewership for. So I'm sure we've all been waiting for this slide, because you can't talk about a millennial without talking about social media. Millennials, young and old, love social media. It's a well-established fact at this point, and it's pretty much just part of who they are. 64% of millennials are visiting social media sites 3 or more times a day. Probably more like 3 or more times an hour, but here we have 3 or more times a day. And they're most likely doing this via their smartphones and their computers. Facebook is the top social media site, and millennials are highly likely to talk about things they see on social media and face-to-face conversations with their peers and colleagues And they're often online clicking on links posted by other people on social media. This is the way most of them get their news. So social media is at the center of all the millennials universe and pretty much everything they're doing. It's interesting to note that a majority of them would actually rather read other people's comments on social media than actively be posting and participating in the conversation themselves. This isn't too surprising given the fact that we often hear millennials griping about their parents' and older relatives' social media habits. Millennials are active and they're logging hours and hours and accessing social media quite a bit. We're looking at the number of visits here and time spent on social media sites on their smartphones only in the last 30 days. For young millennials, sites like Reddit, Instagram, Facebook, and music streaming apps like Spotify and Pandora are really standing out. With young millennials, they're spending around 5 hours a month on Reddit. And again, this is just on their phone, not including computer or tablet. That's a ton of time. If you take a look at old millennials, they're more likely to be visiting and spending time on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook than the young millennials. Both young and old millennials are spending around 6 hours a month on Facebook. This is, again, on their phones only. Facebook is more likely to be used by an older millennial, but this is probably because they were around when Facebook was first started, so they're using it more. But Facebook is still king amongst the two. However, there are still a wealth of options out there for social media, and there is definitely a difference in which sites the young and old are spending most of their time on. We talked about millennials being multitaskers. Here we have the time spent in an average day of what all the activities that a millennial is doing. They're packing in a ton of activities into an average day. Young millennials are busy. They're cramming 77 hours of activities into a 24-hour day, while old millennials are cramming in a much less 60 hours a day of activities in comparison to their young counterparts. This could really be because they're working more and dealing with their kids, and just in general, they don't have as much free time as a young millennial might. Young millennials are the multitasking generation. They have a ton going on all the time, and things are always changing. So how do we reach a target that's pretty much constantly on the go? When we're looking at reach on particular platforms, the cell phone is number one. Everybody has one. It might as well be like part of your body at this point. Nobody really likes to not have a cell phone. It's a necessity. Millennials are more likely to have a cell phone than a television, but don't really count out traditional media just yet. It still is important to them, especially for our older millennials. Older millennials are ranking higher in reach for things like radio, TV, and magazines than their younger counterparts. PC, at work, and home are also big with older millennials. Younger millennials rely less on traditional media and have higher reach with their cell phone, obviously, video games, and streaming media devices. So if you're really wondering what is media to millennials, the answer is pretty much everything. We just further established that millennials love their phones. I mean, we know this. We've probably all been to a party where we're trying to talk to somebody and then we look up and the whole room is on their phone and nobody's actually talking to each other. They all have cell phones, but young millennials are more likely to be using it for literally everything. The old ones are using their phones a ton, but more as a source for information and communication. They're much more traditional when it comes to seeking out entertainment. They're relying on things like TV, radio, and DVR. Younger millennials are using their phones for information, communication, and entertainment. They also look to video games for entertainment, but you notice that TV is nowhere to be found as far as entertainment goes amongst the younger millennials. They haven't really gotten rid of TV completely as they are relying on it as a form of information. So lastly, we're going to take a look at incremental reach, specifically how we can reach an older young millennial using streaming media, mobile phones, and TV. If you look here, it's pretty much identical. You can reach almost 100% of each audience using these three devices. From what we have discovered about old and young millennials, it's clear that there are differences. But if you look at their media habits, the reach really isn't changing much across the two groups. So when speaking to millennials, it is important not to throw them all into one big bucket. The key is to focus on the message you are sending, not necessarily the medium. So I'm just going to give a pretty broad example here to close out. You can send an ad to all millennials on their smartphone and streaming media device, and odds are they're going to see it. It's the message of that ad that is going to determine whether they are receptive or not. Like Jen stated earlier, younger millennials, I've said that word too much today, are more image concerned. They want to look good. They're kind of frivolous with money. Older millennials are more practical. They're concerned about quality and price and less of their image to others. So if an advertiser just sends one ad with an overall message that focuses on images, looks, and status, odds are a younger millennial who saw that on their phone will bite on it. But that ad won't hit an older millennial in the same way because we know they aren't as concerned with their image anymore. They're practical, and you need to appeal to that. So rather than just lumping all millennials together, take a look at them as separate entities, old and young. Look at the message you want to send to each of them. Perhaps it will be two separate ones. Perhaps you can combine a message that mixes practicality and frivolity together. But again, at the end of the day, focus on the message you're sending to these two groups because the mediums by which to reach them really aren't changing that much between the two of them. So just in summary, although there are many similarities that unite the millennial generation, there really are some key differences between the young and old. They're at different stages in their life and are experiencing different things. The younger millennials are more diverse. They're still figuring out their path in life, while the older are more settled. Their money and shopping habits differ from each other as well, but when we look at how to reach them, we find they're pretty similar in their media consumption. Social media, the internet, and cell phones, they're utilities for both groups. They really can't live without them. Linear media is still an option, but this applies mostly to the older millennial. Millennials are born multitaskers. Young millennials are cramming 70+ hours of activity into an average day as opposed to the older millennial who has less time to multitask. Yes, they are all tech obsessed, but it's the message that you're sending to them that is important, not necessarily the medium by which you reach them. Because we know those remain consistent across the two groups. It really remains to be seen whether the young millennial is going to follow the same traditional life path as the older millennials and generations before them, but it's really going to be important to take note of how these two groups evolve separately or together over time, as they ultimately really are our new American consumer. So that concludes the presentation portion of today. I'm going to go ahead and send that back over to Stuart for questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
Great. Well, thank you, Ashley, and thank you, Jennifer. Again, there's a lot of information here, and certainly a lot of people in the audience with questions. I just want to remind everyone, if you do have a question for our speakers related to this great research on millennials that Simmons Research has conducted, just use the Q&A tool on the left side of your screen. We're going to get to as many questions as we can in the next 10 minutes or so, and if we don't get to your question, I will make sure it gets forwarded over to our speakers today. I also want to remind everyone, if you are interested in getting a copy of today's slide deck, you will find it in the resource list tab up at the top of your screen. So you can go on in there and download a PDF of the slides. Feel free to share those with your colleagues or go over them. And also, today's webinar has been recorded, so you can return and listen to the on-demand version if you want to catch up on some of these things, and certainly share that recording with your colleagues as well. Let's jump over to some of these questions. So, Ashley, let me just start off with you. And we had a number of people asking this, and so if we can just maybe return to one thing, and that is the difference and sort of where the split between young millennial and old millennial occurs. Is it a firm split? Is it more just sort of that various life stage, right, where you're married with kids versus single, or is there a specific year where you're using to break that down?
For the young versus old, we picked those. There's not really a hard stop in between the two of them. We were more just looking at them as bigger groups as a whole, like you said, the marriage or just graduating school, et cetera, because everybody is in a different life stage, and it's certainly something to take into consideration when we're looking at the two of them. However, for the age brackets that we did use, the young were going to be 18 to 29, and the old, we were doing 30 to 39. Now, that does include people on the front end and the back end that are cusp years that might belong to different generations, but they might exhibit the same behaviors as the young and old millennial.
It's funny when you were using the ages and you said 39 or 38, all these people suddenly, we got all these people saying 38-year-old millennial, and then I think probably they should slap themselves because millennials are, the beginning of the millennial generation is getting that old, and I think that's sort of one of the things that's really eye-opening from some of the things that you were discussing here.
Certainly, as an old millennial myself, a lot of times I'm like, well, I don't necessarily fit that, and I know other people have the same thoughts, young versus old.
Yeah. So Jen, another question that came up was related to shopping, and it was when you were bringing up those list of stores, and a number of people were sort of asking, why is this store on there, or why isn't Amazon on there? And do you just want to maybe return to maybe sort of what you found out on some of that shopping? And I know, again, I'm sure Amazon showed up on both, but really maybe to clarify, you were looking at what were unique to the different segments as opposed to what was common across everyone.
Exactly. So what we did is we looked, we ran all the stores that people were shopping online and sorted them out by those two. And Amazon totally pops to the top for both groups. But what we wanted to do was dig a little bit in and be like, let's find out what's different between the two. And one of the challenges with online shopping and trying to measure it in any kind of way is that there's just so many sites out there. So, and younger millennials in particular are kind of all over the place. Like they're really happy or comfortable going to a site that they're really not familiar with and buying things that are giving them their card info or something like that. Whereas what showed up a little bit in the data is that our older millennials they didn't have as much of those long tail stores as we were seeing. So, but definitely, Amazon's at the top of anything of these that you do. What we were looking at is the ones that one shopped at and didn't, and the other one didn't.
Okay. Just want to remind our audience again, if you've got a question for our speakers today, please go ahead and submit it. We've got a bunch of them queued up here, but let me pose this to both of you, or if you have any insights. And this I thought was an interesting question. One of the things we hear often about millennials is sort of their desire to be part of the community, their desire to give back, how they look at their jobs, and how they're driving a lot of the things for when you get Community Day or looking for employers that way, or looking at brands that are a little more socially conscious. And so one of the questions was, sort of how do you see millennials engaging with causes, with NGOs, and whether you have any insights in that area?
So we didn't actually.
And by the way, if you don't have it, that's fine as well. Well, we get all that.
Yeah, we do have some questions about, do you like to get out there and get involved in something? If there's something you feel really strongly about, will you, protest or get involved in that sort of thing? We didn't run that for this. Like I said a couple times, we have so many data points that I could probably talk about this for weeks on end. But if we definitely would love to have a further conversation with the people who are asking those questions and go into this a little bit, because we do have some of that data. It just, we could have gone off on 400 different tangents to try and figure that one out. But, we'd all be sitting here for 6 more weeks and everybody would be sleeping because we'd still be talking.
Right. Well, and it's looking as I go through the questions here, and I'm trying to look for the ones that are sort of global in nature. And certainly, a lot of people are asking, well, do you have any insights on how millennials view this, right? And again, things like health care or privacy or any of those issues. Is there anything that maybe you didn't cover today that sort of falls in that area that you can highlight, or is this something that again, where someone maybe should be reaching out to Simmons Research and saying, this is some research we want to start to conduct?
Well, we do have questions. Oh, sorry, we do have lots of questions on healthcare and some of the questions. Like, do you prefer over-the-counter or prescription? What kind of healthcare coverage do you have? We have some health segments similar to our shopping segments. But again, we just didn't go into those. I'm more than happy to have follow-up conversations with anyone and talk them through some of these things. But we kind of went for the broadest things that we could find here.
Got it. Can we talk for 1 second maybe about some of the segments that are in here that, again, these are things that people are asking about. And certainly one of them is, of course, gender splits between, millennial men and millennial women. And then, I know you did break out the Hispanic segment because certainly among the millennial generation, that is one that sort of has long bubbled up as being sort of a unique area. But are there other segmentations, African American, Asian American, that you see, and how might something like that get covered?
Again, that's another one of the things where we ask, African American, we ask Asian American, we have those questions, but we tried to keep this focused. I mean, we have a big Hispanic study, as part of the National Consumer Study. We really focus on our Hispanics. So we brought them in here just because it was a big enough collection to add, and thought some of the parallels and differences were particularly appropriate. Again, love to follow up and have that conversation to run this kind of data for our African Americans or for Asians, or we have another group as well. But we do have that. We have male and female, but we didn't look at that either, too.
I can just say, as far as the male and female split go, it's pretty much even amongst them. Young and old, it's about a range of 48 to 52% on either side. So pretty much half and half, male and female. Got it.
So, I'm looking at the time here, and I'm seeing we're about to sort of hit the top of the hour. So again, I'm going to forward these questions over to you guys, and with the opportunity to sort of reach over to some of these people offline. There certainly are a lot of questions just related to, again, some of these different segments, and maybe there's an opportunity to have a conversation about that. Again, thanks to our speakers from Simmons Research for sharing their great insights today. Thanks to our audience for taking time out of your day to join us, and we look forward to seeing everyone at an upcoming Adweek webinar.